Hey folks, this is Akshay Dhavre and welcome to another video from Photographic. Now today we're going to be shooting portraits with the Leica Q2. Let's see what you got. Alright, so today we're going to be shooting portraits with the Leica Q2, and this is exciting and a little bit daunting for me because it's a 28mm focal length, and this is not my regular focal length for portraits at all. I am predominantly a landscape photographer. I have done a little bit of street like you've seen in a couple of my videos, and less so of portraits. And whenever I did portraits, it was for family and friends, and I just did the natural thing. I picked up a 50mm or an 85mm lens, threw everything out of focus, and no one could complain about those portraits. They always look gorgeous, right? And so that's the lazy way of doing portraits, and I've done enough of that. But 28mm requires me to think in a different way about portraits, and I'm so used to thinking in 50 and 85mm formats that this actually proved to be a challenge, and I'll talk a little bit about it when we see the footage of the shoot. Vidi graciously agreed to model for me during this shoot, and so thanks a lot to her for making this video possible. And she chose a very bright, vibrant cocktail dress to shoot with today. And what we ended up doing was just shooting around the house. The moment I saw the dress, the first picture that came to my mind was, let's do a portrait where we have a wine glass in front of her, she's sitting at the table, and then like a bar behind her. I have this small display unit with a few whiskeys, few wines, some glassware, and so I thought that would be a good, interesting background. And then I could place her in front of that background, and that'll be quite a nice picture. And so I started with that idea in mind, and several things immediately went wrong because like I said, I was visualizing all of this in an 85mm format. And so when I actually started shooting with the 28mm lens, I realized that I'm not going to be able to get the composition the way I had imagined it to be. Which is a bit of a challenge, and so we had to improvise. The second thing that I found was that the light was very harsh. I was using the lamp that looks onto the dining table, and it's a beautiful lamp otherwise, but if you start taking pictures with that light, you realize that it's actually casting very harsh shadows, and it's not good light. So it's not creating a pleasing effect on the model, and that's very important. So you need to pay attention to the light that you're using. I try to remedy that a little bit by using my Godox pocket light, the M1 I think it's called. I picked it up quite recently, and it's quite a powerful little beast. I was able to quickly fill up some of the shadows that were being cast by reflecting the light from the curtain and the window on the other side. But the effect was still not really pleasing, and so I had to resort to using my Godox SL60 with a octabox, 2 layers of diffusion, and then a grid on top of it. Now the grid is not really doing anything in this scenario because the light is pointed directly at the model and the background. Typically you would use a grid when you want to separate the model from the background, but we got some good pictures after I began using those two lights in combination, the Pocket M1 and then the SL60 for my main key light. But I realized that I exhausted all the possibilities with this particular composition because it was just not conducive to 28mm. There's plain wall on both sides of this display unit, and so if you shoot a wider composition with a lot more of the background, suddenly a lot of it becomes uninteresting, and so it wasn't really working out. So I changed the situation and I thought, let's use the Leica for the kind of photographs that it's really meant for, and that's, you know, street style, photojournalistic kind of portraits. And there's an emotion attached to these kind of portraits in my mind. They are in action portraits. You're stealing moments from something that is unfolding in front of you, and that's a very peculiar kind of portraiture, which I haven't really done a lot of, and so this was a great opportunity for me to try that. And so what I did was I asked Vidi to act as if she is at some house party, and she is coming out of a room with a wine glass in one hand, closing the door with her other hand, and then looking across the room to where she's headed to meet some friends. And so that gave us some direction of, you know, what we are looking for. Let's create a scene. And we actually started getting really interesting pictures the moment we started acting as if something was happening. There was an event that was unfolding. And this is where the Leica really shines. These kind of portraits, that they look like snapshots because there is action in them, there's life in those portraits, but they're well made. And so I think that's where Leica really shines, and I want to do more of that in the future for sure. The last scene that we did was just a sitting portrait. Vidi was on the sofa, and again my default visualization got me to look at her eye level, and so I started looking at her eye level. And that's how you usually do portraits. You look, you get down to the level of your subject's eyes. So if you're shooting kids, for example, you would get on the ground instead of shooting kids from up above, the way adults look at kids. And so that creates a connection between you and the subject. And so again, my default mode is get down to eye level, focus on the eyes, throw everything else out of focus, and that's the portrait that no one can complain about. But I quickly realized that eye level portraits are just not working with the 28mm lens, and I'll tell you why. The reason why people choose 50 plus focal lengths for portraits is because it is extremely important for us to maintain the proportion of features on the model's face when you're taking a portrait. Typically anything from 50 to 135 will work really well for portraits because it gives you an absolute distortion-less image, and that's what you need when you're trying to preserve how a person looks. Because if suddenly your subject's nose starts looking huge, or their ears start looking huge because they're standing sideways, or their limbs start looking huge, like someone's arm might look really fat because it's facing the camera. These kind of things happen very, very often, very easily when you're shooting portraits with a wide angle lens, and at 28mm that is a problem. So what that means is I have to keep the subject dead center of the photograph to get a distortion-free reproduction of their face, for example, and that's the part that I definitely do not want to distort. If I go by general rule of thirds, what I was trying to do here was have the model's face on one intersection and the wine glass on the other intersection, and that's 2 points of interest in the photograph, and I was trying to compose photographs like that. But because of the 28mm distortion, if you place the model's face towards the edge, even just going by the rule of thirds, even on the intersection, you will end up stretching out the image, stretching out their face, and that does not look good. And especially with this particular camera, that effect is very pronounced because this is a 28mm full frame camera, and it's a fixed lens camera. So what usually happens is, in a fixed lens camera, the manufacturer does not have to worry about the optical quality of the lens on its own. That lens is not going to be taken out and put on any other camera ever. And so the lens does not have to be optically perfect on its own. It is optically perfect in conjunction with the image sensor and the image processor inside the Leica Q2. And so that package together produces fantastic images. But the lens on its own is not optically great in terms of distortion, not in terms of sharpness. In terms of sharpness, it's absolutely mind-boggling how beautiful this lens is. But in terms of distortion, there is of course barrel distortion that a typical 28mm would cause. And what Leica has done is it tries to correct for this distortion, which means that the edges stretch out and you start seeing very weird distortions, especially if you're taking portraits with this lens. And so this sitting portrait scenario wasn't really working out for us. And then the only way I could think of to use the distortion to my advantage was to actually create compositions where I was intentionally distorting some part of the image. And so what I started doing is taking portraits at different angles. So the first attempt I did was to stand up and look down upon the model. And I also asked Vidi to raise the wine glass towards the camera a little bit. And that gave a very different proportion of the wine glass to Vidi's face to the rest of the background in the picture. And then we started getting interesting images because the distortion actually works to your advantage. And so that was one attempt that we made. The other was to actually lower the angle. And so here I'm going a little below her chin or even further down and looking up at her face. And we got a couple of really good images using this technique as well. So 28mm portraits, very, very intriguing. Something that I definitely want to do a lot more of in the future. And I hope I'll be able to share the journey with you through this channel. This channel has become very exciting for me in the past few days. I wasn't sure about it and I didn't even ask people to subscribe in the first few videos. But thanks to the 70 plus people who've already subscribed to the channel, if you're one of them, thanks a lot for encouraging me to keep this going. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. We're going to be talking about Leica, Sony a7 III, portraits, landscapes, street photography, and hopefully the Sony a7 IV when that actually is available in the market. So thanks a lot and see you in another one. Bye.